Great. And thank you all for being here. I believe that I've met everybody, but just in case not, I'm Dave Rekas. I'm the executive director of 3GNY. And really glad to have you all here. We planned this session several weeks ago. Obviously, news of the last week and a half have changed a little bit how all of us are thinking about our role. But really looking forward to having all of you here as we get started with our school year and with the WEDU program and going out into schools, either virtually or in person, and sharing our family stories. And it's the core of what we do through the WEDU and through 3GNY. And we know that it is really impactful for us, as well as for the students and the audiences that we share with, to help make a personal connection with the history of the Holocaust and help them see that what they might be learning about in school is not simply something that's in the history books, but happened to real people, is still impacting people, us today, and still teaching all of us, including them, lessons that are directly applicable for their life. And so with that in mind, I first came across Marshall Duke, who's our guest today, about a year or two ago. Somebody shared an article with me from the New York Times that featured research that Marshall had done about the power of family stories to build resilience. And Marshall will share a little bit about this research, but what struck me was the focus on children before and after 9/11, and the findings that that children who had a strong sense of who they were and who their families were fared better in terms of their resilience and their ability to cope and to manage through the traumatic events of 9/11 and the aftermath. And that spoke really powerfully to me at the time about the work that we do through WEDU, to learn and tell our family stories, and also to some of the responses I've gotten from teachers and principals who hear our stories and bring our program in, and in addition to the Holocaust specifics that they learn, they're blown away by the idea of connecting their students with the idea of researching their own families. And I've heard of several schools who've started family oral history projects as a result of our speakers going in and presenting. And so, all of that by way of saying that Marshall and his work had been on my radar for a while, and I was thrilled to have a chance to meet him several months ago, and really grateful and honored to have him here today to talk with all of us. Marshall, Dr. Duke, is an emeritus professor of psychology at Emory University in Atlanta. And as a psychologist interested in resilience in children, adults, and families, he's focused for 30 years on the strengthening power of family stories in building and maintaining resilience in kids and families. And over the last decade, he has focused primarily on the stories received on the stories received and carried by children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So he's going to share a little bit about that. And the way that we're going to structure this evening is Marshall's going to share with us for about 20 minutes or so about his work and his research and findings. And then we'll open it up for more of a free-flowing discussion. And we'd love to hear from all of you, things that his talk is sparking in you, or your thoughts about your role in learning and sharing your family story. And we'll take the rest of the time just to talk and to help us process and prepare for continuing our work as 3Gs. So with that, I am pleased and honored to turn it over to Marshall Duke.
Thank you, Dave. Hello, everyone. I am pleased to be here with you, and I'm assuming most of you are from the New York area. I am in Atlanta right now, but I am a New Jersey native. But I've lived in Atlanta for, goodness, 51 years, which means in the minds of the people in Atlanta, I'm a Yankee. So you never get away from that. So I am pleased to get a chance to talk to you, and I really am just awestruck at what you're doing. So first of all, I just want to say that you're going out and talking to the schools and telling the stories and carrying them forward. It's just a remarkable thing, and I just want to tell you that I think it's amazing and wonderful, and I hope that some of the things that I tell you or we talk about tonight will be helpful to you in that endeavor. But it's really important And you were doing it without the research behind it, but I'm trying to give you some of the research behind it, let you know that it is in fact really important and really helpful. So let me tell you a little bit about how this came about. Dave mentioned that 9/11 was an important date, not only in the world, but also for my research program here at Emory. I was part of, at that time, a interdisciplinary research group, and we were charged by the Sloan Foundation, which provided us wonderful support for about 11 years, to look at the things that held families together. The foundation was concerned about families being pulled apart, moms driving the kids after school, dads driving the kids to soccer practice, as Dave would probably realize, and people in different places. The kids who aren't playing soccer are sitting in the back of the car doing their homework, or they're eating food wrapped in paper. So this is what was going on, and they were concerned about what might be pulling the families apart. And our charge, one among 7 centers in the United States, was to look at the things that hold families together. And we began to look at the importance of rituals and stories as things that kind of provide touchstones, glue to keep families together. And we began by gathering together a group of families who agreed to let us sort of come into their homes and listen to their conversations at dinner time, and give them some surveys and ask questions about what they did and how they adjusted to things and so on. Very bland kind of stuff at the start. Then in the summer of 2001, we had completed gathering our data, and then September comes and the world changes. And everybody kind of shut down. My brother was in one of the towers. Thank goodness he did survive, but he was on the 68th floor of the first tower that was hit, second tower to come down. And he did get out. He was one of the people that you probably saw on the news covered with dust, walking up the streets away from the World Trade Center. So everybody stopped for a while, and then because we are researchers and we're interested in events that happen like that, and events that you can't plan. God forbid you would ever plan something like this, but this is called a naturally occurring experiment. All of the United States, especially New York, learned about and experienced something terrible at the same time. And because we're psychologists also, we're interested in individual differences. We had all sorts of data on families, and we locked ourselves in our houses just like everybody else, but then people started coming out, and we knew that different families sort of recovered or went back to their daily lives more quickly than others. So when you have those sorts of differences, it's always intriguing what brings about those differences. And we went back to the families and we said, would you tell us something about how you bounced back? And they told us what they did, and we tried to organize the families into groups that bounced back more quickly and less quickly. And we had one measure that was in the battery of measures that we had given the families in the summer before 9/11. And it was a measure that we had developed on the basis of some clinical observation that was made by a psychologist who worked with children who had educational and psychological problems. And she said, I've noticed that kids who know a lot about their family background seem to bounce back more quickly. Now, 9/11 changed everything for us because we were no longer preventing terrible things from happening to our kids. I mean, bad things happen, but not like that. Terrible thing happened to our kids. We couldn't control it. And it was clear that prevention is not the way to look at raising kids on its own. You have to say, well, I need to also build resilience in them. We need to build resilience in us. And so she said that this clinician, the more the kids knew about their families, the better they seemed to do in trying to get back from whatever it was that was challenging them. If they were having trouble in school, if they were having trouble with friends, if they had some sort of problems with anxiety or depression or things of that sort, they seemed to be more resilient if they knew more about their family background. We developed a very, very easy, simple scale called the Do You Know scale, DYK, do you know? 20 simple questions. Do you know where your parents grew up? Do you know where your grandfather was born? Do you know where your grandmother was born? Do you know what your grandfather did for a living? Do you know anything about when you were born? What happened around that time? Now, the common factor in all of these questions was that they could not have known the answers from experience. Somebody had to have told them. In other words, they received this information through family stories, through dinner time stories, through stories told at birthday parties, through gatherings for different events, but somebody told them the answers to the questions. And the more the kids knew, the more resilient they were. Well, this set us on a path, and I limited time, so the path ultimately led to our realization that there was something about knowledge of family background that rendered kids more resilient, rendered families more resilient. And the information came to kids in the form of stories. And how did we understand this? We did research on this for about 10 years. I certainly am not going to tell you all about that, but what we arrived at ultimately is that the knowledge of one's background can take one of three forms. A family history can take one of three forms. There is something called an ascending family narrative. An ascending family narrative is one which says, well, when we first came to this country, we had nothing. You've heard these stories, right? My grandfather came with $5 in his pocket and he built a business, and this is an ascending family story, and here we are, we're doing okay, but we started out pretty low. And then there's a descending family narrative, which some people have, and that is at one point they were very well off, and then they hit hard times. Many older people have this story, people who went through the Depression, for example, in 1929. So some grandparents, or even of yours great-grandparents, may have this story. They were doing great, and then descending family narrative. But in fact, every family narrative is not either a descending or an ascending family narrative. If we looked at the shape of pretty much every family's story, not what the kids know, but if we look at the shape of every kid's family story, we will find what's called an oscillating family history. An oscillating family history is what's real. That is, in every single family, there are high points and there are low points. There are good things that happen, there are bad things that happen. And early child psychology, the wisdom or lack of it of early child psychology was don't talk about the bad stuff. I mean, if any of you know Yiddish, it's nicht mit der Kinder gered. You know this, Rebecca knows what this is. Don't talk about this in front of the children. And that was the way my grandparents were, and my parents. Don't talk about it in front of the children. It turns out that the families that were the most resilient not only had oscillating family histories, but they transmitted an oscillating family narrative. That is, they told kids at a proper age, not in a little, but at an age that they could process this information, they told kids about bad things that happened in their family history. And if the things that happened were surmountable, they talked about how they got out of this situation. We worked hard, we moved, whatever. They know the story of how they came up from the down and got to be okay again. If the problem was insurmountable, a loss of a family member in World War II, something that happened during the Holocaust. If it was insurmountable, they talked about how the family went forward, even with this terrible thing happening. In other words, the stories were stories filled with resilience. You belong to a family that takes a hit, rises up, moves forward. And that's how we deal with things. And there are many examples of it that we've given you in this family narrative that you have. The stories are usually told by grandparents more than parents. And we looked at all sorts of groups of people over the years, and the kids who knew more were more resilient. Now, it's sort of maybe something you wouldn't expect, but the stories, one of the earlier questions that was put to us was, well, how do you know the kids are telling you the truth, that they actually knew what happened? And so we did a couple of studies where we actually asked the parents of the kids, answer the questions. Where was your father? In other words, the child's grandfather. Where was your father born? What did he do? We're assuming that the parent is telling these sorts of things accurately. And then we would compare the kids' answers with what the parents said. And it turned out that the kids didn't always have the correct answer. They had an answer, they didn't have the correct answer, but it didn't matter. If they had an answer, if they had knowledge of the family history that they believed to be the case, the resilience still remained. We also found, by the way, and you probably have experienced this in your family, is that if we check mom's answer with mom's sister or a sibling, is that very often family stories are not agreed upon by everybody in the family. They're lifelong arguments. That never happened. You know, Aunt Sadie didn't do that. Oh, yes, she did. And so it turns out family stories are, in fact, Baba Mice's, you know, this a grandma story, which when we use the word Baba Mice, by definition, it's not true. It's a story. But it doesn't matter. It turns out that having the story, having a story, is really the most important thing. And having a story that is coherent. It's a coherent story. There's a sense of connectedness among all the things that are told in the story. So there needs to be coherence. And coherent stories are kind of hard to come by for some groups of people. And this is where I'm talking about you. I'm talking about kids who are grandchildren of survivors. It turned out that the groups that were very well adjusted, who did not know their family backgrounds as we went on with the research, included two major groups who didn't know a lot of the background of their families, but nonetheless were pretty resilient. Children, but more so grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and children or grandchildren of people who had been in war. Now, the common factors between these two groups is that in both cases, the people who experienced the events very often didn't want to talk about them. And the children of the people who experienced the events, your parents, didn't want to ask for fear of upsetting their parents. And so there was something that the researchers here called the double wall of silence. The survivors didn't want to talk. The children of the survivors didn't want to press them. And so the stories very often were very sparse. Now, I began to study the grandchildren because of a book that was written in Germany about 25 years ago. There's a researcher in Germany who came to visit us, probably 20 years ago, at Emory. and his name is Harold Welzer, W-E-L-Z-E-R. And if you're interested, you could look at this book. It's been translated into English. The name of the book is Opa war kein Nazi. Grandpa was not a Nazi. And what Harold Welzer did was to interview grandchildren of Nazi perpetrators and ask them, what did your grandparents do during the war? And the stories that he heard did not match the evidence that he had about what they actually had done. The stories had been transformed over the 3 generations into much softer versions. In some extreme cases, SS officers were remembered as having helped Jews. The grandchildren believed that their grandparents had actually helped Jews, when in fact the grandparents documented were SS. So what Welzer said is that the stories are being transformed, they're being changed. And so the questions that we had at the project was, is that the same thing happening with the grandchildren of the survivors, with the 3Gs? Are the stories that you know very different? Are they being transformed, changed, softened, sharpened in some way? Or are they accurate representations or complete representations of what happened? And it turns out that they're not being changed in the same way that the German stories are being changed, but they're also, in many cases, incomplete. And so from a broader perspective, the reason I see groups like 3G New York, or in Boston or San Francisco or other places where 3G groups have organized is because your generation are the last living links to the survivors. Your generation is likely the only or last generation to have had, if you did, direct interaction with the survivors. My grandchildren are 4G. I have 3 grandchildren who are 4G because my daughter-in-law is 3G. And oddly, the oldest of them did get a chance to meet one of her grandparents. She's 15 now. So the thing that we are at right now is thinking about the importance of the stories. I can tell you that knowledge of what happened historically is not necessarily seen as something outside of someone. It becomes incorporated. I remember, Dave, I think several years ago, I spoke at the 3G meeting in New York, and I can't remember who it was, but it was I proposed the following hypothetical situation. I said, let's say I take a group of high school students from a Christian high school, and I take them to a Holocaust museum, such as there are in New York. We have a Holocaust museum in Atlanta. Very often schools come for trips and they learn about what happened. I said, let's take a group of Christian teenagers and take them to the Holocaust museum and let them go through. And then after it's over, the tour's over, and I say to the students, okay, here's what I want you to do. Can you create a history of your family, imagining that one of your grandparents is a survivor? Can you create an imaginary story based upon what you saw in the museum? And the answer, I think everybody agreed, was yes, they could. They could create a plausible story. And then I can't remember who it was, Dave. But one of the older gentlemen said, he said, there's a difference. And I said, what's the difference? He says, we own the story. They don't. And it turns out that owning the story is among the most critical variables in what we're dealing with. That is, when something is given to you as a story, you can hear about it, you can make up a story. But if you own the story of being the grandchild of a survivor, it's very different from knowing a story that might apply to a survivor. And it turns out also that the story need not be in great detail to have the positive effect of ownership. And the reason why the family stories in general, it seems, provide such support for people is because they belong to the story and the story belongs to them. And so if a child, a plain old child, hears about something terrible that happened years ago, or an Israeli child today hears about the war in 1973, or the other wars that Israel has had with the Palestinians, with Hamas. They hear stories of how it happened and how it was responded to and what happened afterward. And they hear these oscillating family narratives, but they own the story. And even if they're 10 years old, knowing what happened in 1973 makes them stronger. Because I belong to a people that dealt with that in 1973. Similarly, when people hear a story about their family, or you hear stories or generate stories about your grandparents, you're connected to that. And I think that's one of the reasons why you go and talk about it. You're connected to that. It's part of you. You own the story. And you become responsible for it. And the responsibility component, I'll just say this and then open up for some discussion. The responsibility component is really critical, because responsibility for the story is something I think that you're feeling. And I may be wrong about this. So as Dave knows, I'm certainly open to people saying to me, that's wrong. You know, I'm an old guy, I can take it. But responsibility for the story is only part of the reason why people carry it forward. Because we also have a responsibility to the story. If we have a story that has been given to us by family, and the story includes both up and down, oscillation, we become responsible to that story to keep it alive, to transmit it, to be sure that the resilience that the story provides is passed on to continuing generations. So you, I know, will tell these stories to your kids, but when you go to a school and you tell the stories that you own to high schoolers, to elementary schoolers, older elementary schoolers, or whoever you're telling them to, you're actually giving them a model that they can use for understanding the things that happen in their life. Because here you are, you're looking like you're okay people. And you're talking about a family history that includes some pretty not okay things. But you go there and you're friendly and nice and open and sharing. And they say, here's this person who is doing okay. And look what's in the background of their life or in their family. That tells me that even if something terrible happens in my experience, over time, I'll be okay also. So the content of what you do is certainly, surely important, but the process of what you do, appearing and saying, I'm the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, this is what I know that happened to my grandparents. You're saying to them, people are resilient, people survive, people rise above. And what you might think is just an unbelievable tragedy in one moment can, in many circumstances, be risen above, lived with, reckoned with, and become something that's a source of strength. So Dave, that's what I want to share with you. I would love to know, not this, Dave suggested some prompts, and the only prompt that I would have is I would like to know how you receive the story that you have, that you tell. because we know that very often you don't get the story in one piece, that you might get a fragment, you might get a slip of the tongue, that a grandparent says something, or you read something, or you see a photo. But what you have done is help to create the stories that you tell.
Mhm.
And you probably have not had a moment, I may be wrong about this, where someone has sat down with you and said, here's all the story that happened to your grandparents. Here it is in one telling. That didn't happen. You had to put it together. So I'd love to hear about how that came about, but also I'm certainly open to any other topic that you'd like to discuss about this.
Marshall, first of all, thank you for sharing so much of what you've learned and how you've learned. And I know I have lots of notes and questions and thought trains that are going off in different directions. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to stop the recording so that we can engage more in open discussion.